speaker. You know, the Torah that we use today, the Vlashim Torah, means so much to this community. That connection to a particular place. The beautiful, beautiful ark that was built to house this Torah, which, if you don't know, normally is right outside the chapel, the Beit Tefillah. We've been using it now right behind Bill for our services as we are have been in lockdown. We're actually going to have a beautiful new ark soon, and it'll go back to its special place. But go and look at the Torah, feel it. When we use it on Yom Kippur, when we use it soon at Ian's Bar Mitzvah, touch it. There's something about that tactile feel of a Torah that's so powerful. Today we're going to learn about it. The Torah is from the Memorial Scroll Trust. You'll learn about that trust. You'll learn about these Torahs. We are so blessed today to have Lois Roman, who is a trustee of the Memorial Scroll Trust. She serves as the U.S. representative based on the East Coast. She's zooming in from New Jersey, and she's going to tell us about these Torahs. Extraordinary story. Our scroll, scroll 3, 436, 436, which honors the memory of the Jews from the town of Vlashim. It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Lois, and after Lois talks, we'll do some Q&A.
Thank you, Rabbi, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about the Memorial Scrolls Trust and our Czech Torah collection. I am going to share my screen, and while I'm busy doing that, I want to remind you of the Rabbi's words at the beginning of the Torah section, and he talked about promises. He talked about the promise of bringing Joseph's bones back out of Egypt. He talked about linking the past to the present, and that's what my comments today will be all about. So I hope you can see my blue slides. Rabbi, can you just tell me that you can, please?
We are good. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. So today I'm going to tell you the story of survival of one of your oldest congregants. As the rabbi mentioned, it's scroll number 436 out of our collection. And this scroll, not the one in the picture, but the one that we were just praying from, was written 130 years ago in 1890 for the small community in Bohemia of Vlasim. And before we begin, I just want to set the stage. So I know you all know what a Torah scroll is, but I want you to look carefully at this photo of how we are used to seeing Torah scrolls, dressed beautifully with silver in a wooden ark. All of the Torahs are written by hand by a special rabbi with a quill pen and special ink. Even today, that's the case. And it takes more than a year to write an entire Torah scroll. I also want to talk about geography. So I will use the words Bohemia and Moravia often in the next few minutes, and let's make sure we all know where that is. So this blue picture is what we currently call the Czech Republic, or recently renamed Czechia. And the western portion of this blue blob is Bohemia, and the eastern portion is Moravia. Back in medieval times, these were two different groups of people ruled by two different ruling families. We think of it all as the Czech Republic, but native Czechs will tell you that there actually was a difference between Bohemians and Moravians, but I'm not going to go there right now. I've also shown you where the big city of Prague is on this map and where this much smaller town of Vlašim is to the southeast of Prague. All of these little black dots represent the towns where our scroll collection came from. There were actually more than 350 towns in this blue area that contained Jewish settlements over the years. And when the Torah scrolls were sent for collection to Prague, they were brought to some of the larger towns and then sent on to Prague. Notice for a minute the neighbors. So you have Germany on the western portion, Austria just to the south, and Poland to the east. So Czech Jewry sit firmly in Central Europe, not Eastern Europe. And the Jews in the Czech lands had much more in common with the German and Viennese Jews than they did with the Jews in the shtetls of Poland. That's very important to remember as we go through my talk. The Jews were quite assimilated. They adopted Jewish enlightenment from the Germans, and the Jews spoke German. They lost their ability to speak Yiddish, and they were, for the most part, educated and working class, part of the bourgeoisie of the Czech lands. Now, there was 1,000 years of Jewish history in these lands before World War II, and I just want to talk about that for a second. On the left-hand side here, you see a photograph of the Old New Synagogue, which was built in 1270. It still exists today in the city of Prague. In fact, you can go inside and attend services there. The Jews of Prague and Bohemia Moravia were very spiritual and Kabbalistic and mystical. I put in this etching here in the center of Rabbi Lois, a very famous 15th century rabbi who's associated with the tale of the Golem. For those of you that might need a little reminding, the Golem was a monster that the rabbis who learned special incantations could create from a lump of clay. They would say the incantation and the Golem would arise, and he would protect the Jewish community during times of strife. And when the rabbi and the Jewish community no longer needed this monster, the rabbi would say a different incantation and the monster would fall back into that original lump of clay. Well, the tale goes that Rabbi Lois needed one of these golems, so he created it, he got rid of it, he scooped up the soil and deposited it in the attic of that old new synagogue on the left. And the tale is that it still sits there in the Geniza of the old new synagogue. I mentioned that Jews were highly assimilated in these lands. In 1848, the Jews were emancipated also in these lands. And we think about emancipation coming from the French Revolution in 1789, and it took a long time for that idea of freedom to spread eastward. Nonetheless, in the middle of the 19th century, Jews in these lands were suddenly able to live anywhere they wanted. They could go to university, they could have any job they wanted, and of course, Jewish life blossomed. Also, many Jews from the East, where there wasn't emancipation yet, came into the lands of Bohemia and Moravia to take part in this blossoming of Jewish life. Now, the Jews were so comfortable living here in a land of freedom, in a land of opportunity, and in a place where there was limited anti-Semitism, that they created a Jewish museum in 1906. So it seems to me you need three things for a Jewish museum. You need artifacts, which they had because the city planners, once there was emancipation and Jews started to move around the country, decided to get rid of or demolish the old Jewish tenements in the Jewish quarter of Prague and build prettier buildings. Unfortunately, they also demolished a few of the older synagogue buildings, creating artifacts, ancient Judaica that needed a home. So the museum seemed like a good idea. Also, the Jews in this area of the world were wealthier. They had businesses, they made money, and so they could be benefactors and donors for this museum. But most importantly, the Jews had to feel comfortable here to put a sign above the door that said, Jewish Museum Welcome. And in fact, Jews, non-Jews, and visitors to the big city of Prague came and visited the collection of about 800 pieces of Judaica. Now, all was really fine in this land until 1938. We've heard about the rise of Nazis in Germany, and in 1938, to appease Hitler, the Allied forces annexed the most western portion of Bohemia to the Nazis. As soon as that happened, the Nazi army marched into the western border. They set every synagogue on fire. They demolished all the Jewish homes. They kicked all the Jews out and sent them to Prague. Well, it didn't appease Hitler. And in a few months, in 1939, the armies marched through the rest of Bohemia and Moravia and took over Prague. Well, all of Jewish life ceased to be the same at that point. What's interesting, though, is that from 1939 to 1942, there was an interesting dichotomy happening where the Jews were kicked out of universities and they weren't allowed to practice medicine or law, but they were allowed to stay in their houses all over the country, and they were still allowed to practice Judaism, although in a diminished form. So I can talk for a long time today about World War II history or the Holocaust, but I don't want to do that. I only want to talk about how it is that our collection of Torah scrolls survived. And the answer is they survived in plain sight. So let me tell you the tale using 4 miracles. Miracle number 1. This is a picture of what happened to the Torah scrolls when the Nazis invaded the Sudetenland in 1938. You can see here Torah scrolls are ripped, they're open, they're on the floor. Well, the Jewish community in Prague, who had heard what happened when the Nazis arrived, were terribly concerned about what was going to happen to all of the Jewish communities in Bohemia and Moravia. And when the Nazis arrived in Prague in 1939, the Jewish community was already trying to figure out how they could help themselves. Well, it turns out, as in most places, that the Nazis wanted to collect Judaica. What they were really interested in were the old books from the medieval times, and of course, the silver. And through a longer story than I'm going to tell you right now, the Jewish community approached the head of the SS in Prague, and they said, listen, you want us to collect the Judaica that you're interested in, and because we're curators of the museum, we know how to catalog this stuff. We can help you. So instead of only sending out a letter saying, please send us your valuable books, the Jewish community sent out a letter that said, please send us all of the movable Judaica. And in a very short period of time, the number of artifacts at the Jewish Museum of Prague went from 800 to over 250,000 pieces of Judaica. It included all the Torah scrolls. It also included the Ner Tamids, the Ark curtains, the prayer books, the musical instruments. Everything that wasn't nailed down was boxed up and sent to Prague. This also corresponded with the beginning of the deportations of the Jews to the concentration camp Terezin. Well, the curators filled out index cards of every piece of Judaica that came. They were very, very meticulous to make sure that they said what town it was from, how old it was, anything that distinguished it. And they put all of these items together in groupings. So all the Torah scrolls were in the same place and all of the other things were in the same place. And they were put in the abandoned synagogue buildings in Prague. Unfortunately, as the 1940s progressed, all of the Jews that were left in the Czech lands, 118,000 people were sent to Terezin, including the curators of the museum. Which brings me to miracle number 2. After the war, a few thousand Jews survived from the Czech Republic, from the area of Bohemia and Moravia, and one of the survivors was one of the curators of the museum. And when she came back, she knew exactly where those Torah scrolls had been hidden in plain sight. Now, you might ask, why do I put this modern day picture on miracle number 2? This is a picture that I took in 2019 of the Prague Jewish Town Hall. And yes, there are Hebrew letters in the lower clock. And yes, the clock runs backwards and it still tells time. The reason I put this here is to explain to you that no bombs fell on Prague during the war, which meant that wherever the Jewish curators had hidden the Judaica, those buildings were still standing in 1945. Well, by 1948, the communists came in and invaded Bohemia and Moravia. And as soon as that happened, all ideas that perhaps Jewish life could reblossom in these lands ceased to exist. And the Jewish curator went to the Communist Party officials and said, you know, our museum archives are taking up 40 beautiful buildings in downtown Prague that I'm sure you want for the Communist Party. Why don't we move some of our junk to the outskirts? And she got together with a few other Jews, and they moved the Torah scrolls to an abandoned synagogue in the outskirts of Prague called the Mikli Synagogue. Well, that brings me to miracle number 3. In the 1960s, during the Cold War, when there was a big wall separating Germany and Europe from East and West, it was commonplace for British art dealers to get a special visa to go to Prague in the East, to collect artwork and bring it back to the West and sell it to investors in London and New York. On one trip, Eric Esterich, an art dealer from London, was approached by a communist government official. Now I'm riffing here, but I would like to imagine that that man was wearing a raincoat with a hat, and he tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Are you interested in buying some Judaica?" Well, Eric Esterich thought if there was any Judaica left in the East after the war, it would be worth exploring. So they took him to the Mikli synagogue and they opened the door, and in the synagogue building, he saw these giant gray bags that contained scrolls on racks and racks and racks and racks all the way to the back of the synagogue building. Eric came back to London and approached a congregant at this synagogue building, the Westminster Synagogue, a progressive shul in Knightsbridge, London. And he said to Ralph Yablon, "On my recent trip, they approached me and asked me if I wanted to buy Judaica. What do you think?" Ralph said, and this is the 1960s, he said, "If anything is left, of course we have to bring it to the West to preserve it and save it." So he spent 20,000 American dollars at that time to buy the contents of the entire warehouse. And on a rainy Sunday in 1964, 2 trucks pulled up to the synagogue building, and the congregants dressed in casual clothing to do a mitzvah volunteered to unload the truck. Well, when they opened the truck doors, they couldn't believe there were 1,564 giant gray bags that they were unloading into the synagogue building. One congregant at the time said it looked like there were little body bags being carried off the truck. As soon as the last scroll was brought into the building, the congregants wanted to open the bags and see what was inside. So under the rabbi's tutelage, they began looking at the scrolls. Some had bloodstains and bullet holes. Many were burnt, some were ripped, and scroll after scroll had little notes tucked into the rolls of the Torah scroll in Yiddish, in Czech, in German, and in Hebrew, saying, "What is to become of us? God help us." Well, that brings me to miracle number 4. The congregants at the Westminster Synagogue realized that this was a mission much larger than any one individual or even one shul. And they started a nonprofit in London, the predecessor of the Memorial Scrolls Trust, and they put all 1,564 scrolls into the trust. And the trust's mission is to keep the memory of the Czech Jews alive through the use of the artifact. To keep that promise alive, we lend out our scrolls on permanent loan to congregations all over the world. 1,400 scrolls are part of this network. They are located in Europe, in South America, in Australia. We have one in India. We are allocating one to the Arab lands, and we have 1,000 scrolls here in the US. So your scroll is part of a very, very large network. Let's look at our collection in total for just a second. On the left, you see a photo of one of our scrolls that's clearly burnt. I don't know the story of this individual scroll, but I like to imagine that it might have been in a synagogue that was set on fire, and the rabbi or a congregant, or maybe even one of those non-Jewish Czechs that got along so well with their Jewish neighbors, ran in and saved this Torah scroll. The middle picture here is showing you how pretty the script is inside of the scrolls. Now we got to see the script inside your Czech scroll, but this is a different scroll. And people often ask me, "Lois, how do you know they're from the Czech Republic? How do you know they're from Bohemia?" And I say, I'm not a rabbi or a scribe, but the way the letters are formed are indicative of a scribe working in that part of the world. And you can look here at the letter Shin. and see that its right hand lower corner is curved. If this was a shin from, say, a German Torah or a Lithuanian Torah, the right hand lower corner would come to a 90-degree angle. The other interesting letter is this one. It's called a pei within a pei. Normally, peis might be a little bit bigger than the word in a Torah scroll, but they wouldn't have this extra curly thing. This is linked to Kabbalistic spiritualistic thinking. When the scribe wrote a letter like that, it was to tell the rabbi who was reading it, this is a special word or a special passage, and that there would be many more extra meanings hidden in this portion of the Torah scroll. The lower picture is of a binder. Now, I saw your binder. It was colorful, but without words. 400 of our Torah scrolls in our collection came wrapped with a binder. This one is particularly interesting because these words are in Czech, and they say, to the honor and glory of God. Now, I don't know about you, but I always think that anything that would touch a Torah scroll, our most holy document, something that we use with so much awe and reverence. I was pretty surprised to see a Torah binder in the Czech language, but it does go to show you how assimilated the Jews were in the Czech lands. Lastly, this picture on the right is of the inside of one of our Haftarah scrolls. Most of our scrolls written between the 18th and 20th centuries are Torah scrolls. A handful are Haftarah scrolls, and this one was recently renovated, updated, and made kosher by a scribe, and it comes with the cantillation markings, which makes it very, very special indeed. So let's turn for a second to the town of Lashim, and Jews came to live in this smaller town as early as the 1700s. And by 1893, after the Jewish emancipation, there were about 210 Jews in town. Not that large. Most of them worked in the distillery business or as tavern owners. And there were two famous Jews living in this town. The first is a picture here of Gustav Mahler, the composer. He lived in a nearby town, but his aunt lived in this town proper, and he spent every summer with her. So it's quite possible that he might have even held your Torah scroll when he had an aliyah or came to synagogue services. The second famous person from Vlasim is a painter named Solomon Benesh, and this is one of his paintings, very beautiful. Unfortunately, he was killed in the Shoah, but you can look him up and see some of his beautiful creations. There are no more Jews in Vlasim, and the synagogue building itself was torn down under the communists in 1984, but the cemetery still exists. And in 1942, there were only 63 Jews living in town. Many of the Jews had left. They had tried to escape, or they bought themselves a ticket to freedom just before the Nazis invaded. The 63 that were taken to Terezin and then on to Treblinka mostly perished. As far as I know, only 4 survived. And here's the Holocaust Memorial to the Jews of Lasim. There's an annual celebration in this town, and it's attended not always by Jews, but by the non-Jewish Czechs that remember their neighbors. There was a lot of camaraderie. It's almost the way it is today in the United States, where Jews live next to non-Jewish neighbors, their kids went to school together, and they were friends. MST has many ongoing projects. One is we come to visit shuls like yours and retell the story. If you enjoyed some of the photos in my presentation today, a volunteer traveled around the Czech Republic in 2019, taking photos at all of those towns where the scrolls came from. And they recently published a book, which is available on our website. Also, we worked on a binder exhibition to be sent around the world. Unfortunately, it was supposed to leave during COVID, so we've postponed it until 2022 or 23. Here's another example of one of the beautiful binders. The binders, this is called a wimple, a type of binder, goes back to an Ashkenazi folkloric tradition where the mothers and sisters of a baby boy would take the swaddling cloth from his bris, rip it into long pieces and sew it together into a sash. and they would begin embroidering biographical information about that baby boy, his name, his father's name, sometimes his mother's name, and a special prayer that he should grow to good deeds, the Torah and the chuppah. Well, women that were more talented would make fancier embroidery. And here you can see one that has the sign of the bull, Taurus. Obviously, this baby boy was born under the zodiac symbol. We also encourage our shareholders, not during COVID, to have scroll gatherings. And there have been a handful of gatherings around the world over the last 10 years. A recent one in 2019 happened in New York City, where we were able to gather 75 of our Czech Torahs at different congregations. 800 people attended a ceremony at Temple Emmanuel in Manhattan. And here's a photo of some of the scrolls that were gathered together. I love this photo because the scrolls in the foreground, where you see the blue and white striped mantle or the white talit mantle, clearly show that the scroll holders are using the scrolls as memorials to the towns and to the Jews that didn't survive the Shoah. But if you look in the background of the picture, you'll see that some of the mantles or the covering on the Torah get very vibrant and beautiful colors. This tells me that the scrolls are not just about sorrow, but they're also about hope. And as the rabbi mentioned, they are our link from the present day to the past, but also the link from the present day to the future. We like to say that each of our Czech scrolls is a messenger from a Jewish community that was destroyed in the Shoah. Every one of our scrolls is a silent witness to both the vibrant life of Judaism before the war and the horrors of the Holocaust. I ask you to teach your children about miracles because this is a story full of miracles. Thank you for taking care of scroll 436 and using it in your synagogue life. I hope it makes you feel connected, l'dor v'dor, to everyone who's come before and hopefully to everyone who will come in the future. Thank you for listening to me, and I will stop sharing my screen and take any questions either now or later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful.
A bit of housekeeping. Because the Power Hour is going to start in 2 minutes, Bill has posted a link. No? Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a couple questions, and then since it was published on this link, we'll keep it on this link. So we'll just have time for a couple questions. But you know, I want to ask people, when you can come in, ask us to unroll this Torah. Like, I'm going to go look for the shin and the pei now, and it's going to feel really, really different. So if there are any questions, let me know. Either use the hand raising gesture. I'm looking at the gallery screen, but there are 3 screens of you on my computer, so I can't see everyone. So use raise hand if you have a question you want to ask. John, go ahead. Why don't you say it into the microphone? So as John's coming up, how has the Czech Republic supported your work? Comes a question in the chat. And John?
Yeah,
Oh, a couple
I just want to mention I enjoyed your talk immensely, and it really gives me a connection. And the interesting thing is that our neighboring synagogue that had one of these Torahs returned it to the city in Czechoslovakia that needed the Torah again. And they went back, the rabbi and some congregants went back to that city in Czechoslovakia, returning the Torah.
That's absolutely true. And that was exactly how I was going to answer the question the rabbi just asked me. So first of all, there have been some small Jewish communities starting up again in Bohemia and Moravia. And several years ago, the community in Olomouc contacted the trust and asked if we had one of their Torahs from before the war. And they were all out on loan. One happened to be at the synagogue in California. So we called them and we asked, we don't usually take our scrolls back unless the synagogue doesn't need them anymore, but would they give us that one back and we would give them a different one so we could reallocate that particular scroll back to the community that used to house it. And as you mentioned, the California Shul was so generous. They koshered the scroll and brought it themselves back to the land of Moravia. And there was a giant ceremony, which is online, you can look up, where they handed the Torah back to the new congregation there. It was so moving, beautiful. We have another scroll that we've given back to the new rabbi in Prague for the progressive community there. And so, you know, we don't have that many requests because there aren't that many Jewish communities in Bohemia and Moravia, but if they ask, we'll try to help them.
Thank you. Other questions?